Okay, so tonight we're going to talk about how you start with exams as a home educator, because obviously if you've been in school or if you were in school, it all just kind of happens for you to some extent. You get told what's going on, you choose your options, but you don't have to get involved beyond doing what you're told, turning up when you need to. As a home educator, it is not like that. It is all on you, essentially, to decide what you're doing, to organise it all, and to pay for it. So we're going to talk a little bit about that process. Now, it's a big topic. There's lots of different details, and everything we say, there'll be more to it that we could explain. So we are planning to, over time, do more of these webinars about sort of particular aspects of it. So this one is just going to be an overview. We're not going to get into huge amounts of detail on anything. Hopefully you should come out of it knowing roughly what it is, how the whole process works. So you can go off on your own and then dig into the bits that you need to later on. And we'll also point you at some areas where you can go and ask those extra questions when you think about it later on. All right, do you want to go on to the next slide, Sarah? Okay, so this is what we plan to cover tonight. The first thing we'll talk about is how you choose what subjects you're going to do, what qualifications you're going to do. And then we'll talk about how you actually find an exam centre. And an exam centre is like where you go to physically sit the exam. And they're the place that is sort of responsible for, putting you through the qualification, getting that qualification for you at the end of it. What they are not necessarily usually responsible for is actually learning the content for the exam. So finding out, teaching your child what they need to know for the exam, that's a separate thing to actually sitting it. And so then we'll talk a bit about the different ways that you can learn what you need to for the exam. And then we'll talk about the actual process, for your child of booking and taking that exam at the end. Okay, and as Sarah said, if you do have questions as you go along, put them in the chat. We'll go through the talk more or less as is, because that may well cover some of the things that you're interested in. And then at the end, we'll look back at anything we haven't covered, any extra questions you've got. And I would say that the only reason I'm able to sit here explaining this is because I was sitting there not having a clue how to do any of this a few years ago. And I figured it all out, and I only figured it out by asking the questions. So there are no daft questions. You're not expected to know any of this stuff already. And if you're thinking it, somebody else will be thinking it. So do ask the question, and then we can get that information for everybody. All right, so Sarah, do you want to kick off with choosing subjects?
So this is the fun bit. So how do we choose what subjects qualifications we need to do? Well, first of all, GCSEs are not the only option open to home educators. Sometimes we sit international GCSEs, sometimes we sit alternative qualifications. Some of them can be difficult to access, so it's all about research. And there's nobody can do this for you. There's some general guidance that we can give about which subjects are more difficult and which subjects are not. But so much depends on your local area, what's available to you, what your finances are, to make those decisions. So we start from what do you want to do? And quite often that is what do you need to do to get to the next stage. If you don't know what the next stage is, I think very few teenagers do have a definite plan of what they were going to do in 10 years' time. I certainly don't know what I wanted to do as a career now. I knew when I was like 15, didn't quite pan out that way, or did in a very confused manner. But so if you don't, it's about keeping options open. What can you do to keep options open? So key things to think about, we don't need to match the school system. So school system, generally now, most schools are moving back to a 2-year Key Stage 4, having gone down a 3-year plan for a while, it seems to be, from my reading of the teachers groups, that a lot are moving back towards a 2-year system. So that means they study GCSEs in years 10 and 11, and generally they will sit 10, sometimes 11 subjects. We do not need to replicate that. Most schools also offer the English Baccalaureate. Again, we do not need to do that. GCSEs are not compulsory for home educators. We have to provide an efficient, effective, suitable education. We do not have to do qualifications. For some children, they are not the right way to go at all. I'm guessing for most of you being here, you're interested in them. So what do we do? How many do people do? That's one of the questions that come up. It's how many you need to do. So for some it will be none. For some it will be maths and English. For many it's 5. I think probably most home educators edge towards around about 7, 6, 7, so that you've got the 5 in the cushion. Some people do more. Again, it totally depends on your own situation. How near an exam centre you are, what your child is interested in. So there are no right answers to that one. It is totally up to you.
And I would say one thing that can help you make that decision is to have a look at your local colleges or even universities. If they do have an idea, and that idea might just be, I want to do A-levels or I want to do something arty. But if you go and you have a look, most of the sixth form colleges, I think, will often have their entry requirements or a handbook or something. They will say what you need for each course. And the same for universities. Just sort of pick a random selection of sorts of universities you're interested in and see what they're asking for. And the same thing for sixth form courses. Just have a look at a few random courses that they might be interested in, and you start to see patterns of how many subjects they want, whether there's any particular requirements for particular subjects, and what grades they're looking for.
The other thing, we often say there are some subjects which are difficult for home education, but on the other way, we have a wider selection of subjects to choose from.
You can do all your chemistry practicals.
Many home educators come out and they want to do what they were doing in school. Sometimes it's a good idea to look afresh. There is a list on Home Ed Wiki. I will quickly show it. If you've not seen this, this is basically a long-term website that home educators over the years have contributed their knowledge to. Not owned by anybody, it's not maintained by anybody particular. It's simply a wiki that's a dumping ground of home educators' knowledge and experience over the years. But you can see, you scroll down on this page, subjects, there is a list of subjects open to home educators. Some of these are more difficult to access than others, but we can see subjects there such as ancient history, which are not generally offered in an awful lot of schools. So, and you've also got the advantage of you are not having to timetable them against other ones. So if I look at mine have done psychology, sociology, business studies, economics, citizenship, lots of fairly niche subjects that they've done for interest, alongside a couple of the more core tick box subjects, as I tend to think of them. So what subjects you choose is totally up to you. No set requirements. The only ones we will say is there are some that do open more doors than others. So maths and English are what you think of as gateway subjects. They are requirement for funding if you go to college at 16 to 19. To have, ideally before you go, or if not, to be studying them while you are there. So if you don't have them before you go, you have to be studying maths and English alongside the course. So that can limit what courses you do at 16 to 19. So the good ones to get out the way if you possibly can.
And when we say English there, we mean English language. Yeah. So in schools, they usually do English language and English literature. As a home educator, you don't have to do both of those. And often people will only usually do English literature if that's something they're interested in, something they want to go on for further study. It's English language is the key one that's usually asked for in requirements for colleges, for jobs. For
yeah, English lit ticks the box for funding, but
it
generally,
does.
when they say English, jobs, universities ask for English language. English lit is a useful one to do outside of English if you are looking at essay subjects later on. Some more academic colleges might request a subject that shows that you can write essays. And they don't consider that English language does, which is quite interesting, but they don't. So, because they're looking for the analysis, in which case they're looking for something like English language or history. So, but that's looking ahead of what they want to do. As Katie says, if you go on college websites, they will outline that. If that's likely to be a requirement for courses you want to do, your child wants to do, you should see it listed. Coursework subjects, practical coursework subjects can be difficult. So these are things like art, music, the heavy coursework elements. They can be done. They're not impossible to do, but there are only a few exam centres that will take home educators as private candidates to do them. So you're looking at expensive because you tend to have to work with a tutor that's affiliated to that exam centre. If you find a tutor offering art or music, check that they've got an arrangement in place with an exam centre, because it has fallen through for so many home educators. They found a tutor offering it, but the relationship wasn't there with an exam centre. And it's crucial that the two parts come together. You need the exam centre, you need the tutor, and they need the relationship. Same with other cases. I've been doing a bit of research at the moment. There are examples where people have managed things like PE, but they are very few and far between. Most candidates looking at those sort of subjects do alternatives. Things like arts awards or sporting qualifications. There are other of the more core subjects, English language, sciences, geography, computer sciences, that have practical components. Most cases, they don't contribute to the actual grade. But the problem with the GCSE is they have to be done, and the exam centre, well, it actually gets a little bit more complicated than that, but what we have to, I won't go into too much detail there, but what it has to, the exam centre has to sign a declaration, an endorsement that this aspect of the course has been offered to all students. And therefore they have to be able to facilitate it for home educated children, even if in some cases they can be declined. The exam centre still has to say they can offer it. And so for those subjects, IGCSEs work better. IGCSEs, international GCSEs. People get confused by the I. It's always best to refer to them as international GCSEs if you are talking to somebody outside the home ed community. just clarifies what they are. They work the same way as GCSEs, but for some subjects, they don't have the issue with the endorsement being signed for the practical components. It's simply that the candidates have to know about them and be able to answer questions on the exam. So they do offer a better solution for us. The key is research when it comes to the subjects. Wiki will help. We looked at the subjects. If you have a look at these, I'm trying to pick one that I've recently written because then I know it's all right. So what's a good one? Business studies, because that's got lots on there. So this one can be done GCSE or IGCSE, and it tells you at the top and it lines out your options. The wiki is a good place to go for information on that. If not, ask on the exams group. Chances are someone knows that information.
And the exams group, if you've come here from a different Facebook group, is a Facebook group. So you have to request to join as a home educator. I think the link is on the front page of the HE exams wiki, isn't it?
Yeah, it's all over. It's all over the exam.
Yeah, I mean, if you ask any home educator, more or less, they will be able to point you at that exams group. And that's a really good place to ask for questions. Just had a question in the chat about, are international GCSEs recognised by all A-level offering institutions? Essentially, they are recognised as being the same. You will very occasionally find a sixth form college that hasn't heard of them and is a bit dubious, but you just have to explain that basically they're the same thing, or just refer to them as a GCSE, and they almost certainly won't. Anyone who knows what they are recognises them as an equivalent qualification, not precisely the same, but an equivalent qualification to a GCSE. If people haven't heard of them, you may sometimes have to talk that through.
And if you need the information on the wiki, there's page IGCSEs and there's the links. Just in case anybody asks questions about it, you'd actually point to them and say, look, this says they're equal.
One thing that's probably worth just mentioning here, we won't go into too much detail, but there are different exam boards. So the exam centre is the place that you go to sit the exam. The exam board is the organisation that actually writes the exams and marks them for you and gives you the grade. So you've probably heard of some of them. There's, AQA is one of the biggest GCSE exam boards. Edexcel is another very common one. And so you can get, so generally, some subjects are only available from one exam board because they can each choose which ones they offer. Some subjects like business studies, you can see here, is available from lots of different exam boards. And which one you pick is more or less up to you. Said once you've looked at issues like whether they're available at your local exam centre, they're just basically different flavours. It's like whether you buy Coke or Pepsi. It's more or less the same thing. It's just got a slightly different package, a slightly different way of asking the questions. But it's just personal preference which one of them you choose. None of them are easier than any of the others. None of them are, more respected than any of the others. It's what's available to you and what you want to choose.
And to come to the question in the chat about, is it fair that none of the IGCSE subjects have coursework practicals? Absolutely not. They do. There are ones that do. So often you hear that you do IGCSE because there's no practicals. There are. And in fact, there's probably more IGCSEs that have coursework. It's just that it's optional. But yes, some of them do have practicals.
So for instance, languages, both the international GCSE and the regular GCSE have a speaking component for languages. That's no different. For arts, that's largely coursework based in either qualification. It's just those core subjects where for the GCSE, the exam centre has to say that you've done some level of practical work in your own time. For the international GCSE, they don't have to say that.
Yeah. The general very practical subjects like art and music and drama do all have practical work at IGCSE. And in fact, some of them just aren't available to private candidates.
Yeah.
So.
Okay.
Yeah,
let's roll along. So finding an exam centre. So this is obviously the key part, because doesn't matter if you're ready to study for an exam, you need to have somewhere to go and take it. And the last couple of years have been a bit weird, but generally that means you go to a physical building, you write the exam paper there. So it needs to be somewhere that is relatively close to you, or at least that you can travel to. Now, it varies very much where you live, how easy or how hard finding an exam centre is. So this is one of the ones where it's not necessarily very helpful to ask on the national groups and say, where do I find an exam centre? How easy is it? Because some people have found it really, really easy. If you live in a town that's got an established private exam centre, it's no problem at all. If you live out in the sticks, like I do, where you're kind of reliant on a local school that may or may not be able to help you, then it's quite a different kettle of fish. So the main thing to ask is people local to you, is your sort of first place to start. Is if there's home educators in your local area with kids who are a little bit older and have taken GCSEs, you start asking them what exam centres might be available near you. And there are different types of exam centre. Schools is obviously the main one. Any secondary school that sits GCSEs is an exam centre. There are also commercial centres, so tutors and exams is one of the big examples of that. There are others as well, 3A down in Bristol. And there are centres that are set up more or less just to help private candidates take exams. Sometimes they're alongside their own tutoring. So you have a private tutoring service that will be registered to sit exams themselves. And they'll often take in external candidates as well. Sarah, can you show us the Finding an Exam Centre page on the wiki? So what it comes down to is asking people nearby, and there will either be, they can just point you at one of the big private exam centres or a local school that takes private candidates. There is usually, not always, quite a difference in cost between those. Private centres are often sort of between the £150 to £200 mark per subject just to take the exams. Some schools will offer it at cost price, which is just what they have to pay the exam board and what they have to pay their invigilators. And that can be down to £40 or £50 if you're sitting in the back of the exam hall for one of their main exams. Not all schools do it cost price. Some will also put on an admin charge because it is more work for them to help support private candidates. So the cost can vary. The exam centre access can vary. It is relatively common to have to travel quite a long way to find an exam centre. If you have one in your town, you're lucky. That's great. Often you'll have to travel, half an hour, even longer. Some people, in fact, quite a lot of people will travel to a private exam centre and they'll end up staying overnight in a hotel because it's far enough away that they don't think they can get there for an exam in the morning. So just be aware all those things could happen. You can, of course, always try asking at local schools. So if there isn't anywhere near you, you can just send out letters or emails to all of the schools nearby, asking for asking if they'll support you. You will get a lot of no's, but you might be lucky and you might get a yes. There's a lot of information on this page on the exams wiki. It is worth reading all of it, not just skipping to the list of centres. There's a lot of information about how you can find it, what sorts of times you need to be booking for, suggestions for what you should be asking for and finding out from the exam centre. So one thing to say is not all exam centres will offer exams from every exam board. So this is something that kind of goes back round in a circle with which subjects you want to take, and sometimes when you want to take them, because also you don't have to do everything, at the end of year 11, you can spread them out. So it's quite common for home educators to take one exam early, sort of end of year 9, and then another 2 or 3 at year 10, and another 3 or 4 at year 11. And you might find if there's something you want to do that is, say, Cambridge is one of the ones that's slightly more difficult to find an exam centre for sometimes. So you might do just that one year and go and travel to a further away centre and then find a local centre for different exams the next year. And then further down on this page, there is by area, different areas. And this relies on home educators updating it when they have more information. So it's not a guarantee. You may find there's centres on here that for whatever reason are not currently accepting private candidates. You may find there's centres that aren't listed on here that are. If you do find one that isn't listed or some of the information is wrong, please update it on the wiki, because it's only as useful as everyone makes it. And the final thing to say is access arrangements. Now, these are kind of accommodations, reasonable adjustments to the exams, so that if your child would be disadvantaged, if they have something, if they have some sort of impairment that makes exams harder for them, there are a number of different access arrangements that you can apply for. So it can be something like having extra time. It can be having a laptop instead of typing. There's a whole list of them, which we won't go into too much now. I suggest, again, there is a page on the HE exams wiki that describes everything about access arrangements. But the key thing about them is that the exam centre is responsible for working out if your child needs these arrangements. And to do that, there is often a process of assessment that has to kind of cap and over a period of time, and usually quite some time before you're actually taking the exams. So generally for sort of the summer, you'd be looking to make arrangements with the exam centre maybe the September, October beforehand. If you've got access arrangements, it's worth getting in touch with them, quite a lot earlier than that. And you will find advice that says, don't start on a subject until you know you've got an exam centre. Sometimes you can do that. You can find if you've got a private exam centre, it's pretty stable. You can be pretty sure that's still going to be there in a couple of years' time. If you're reliant on a local school, sometimes they're a bit more iffy. And basically what we've done in that situation is we've said, well, worst case, we're going to travel for 2 hours. We're going to go to the private exam centre. We will be able to do it there. Hopefully, there's this other option that's closer. So we sort of said, right, we're going to start on it because we know that we can sit that exam eventually. But we can't be sure that what the local centre will work out until closer to the exam. They're just not prepared to commit to that. So sometimes you can't be 100% sure that you've got it, but you want to just make sure you've got some options that you're happy with, basically.
It's also worth thinking that some boards are safer than others.
Yeah.
So generally it's a lot easier to find a board it's a lot easier to find an exam centre for Edexcel than it is for Cambridge if you're looking at GCSEs. Not all subjects are offered by both, but it might, if you're having to start studying without an exam centre lined up, then it makes sense to pick safer options.
Yeah, and generally speaking, I'd say Edexcel is, the most widely accepted. Can't guarantee it, but almost all schools will do Edexcel, and often the private tutoring centres, if they support a limited number of boards, Edexcel is usually one of them.
I'm going to add a little thing to it. I work in an exam centre. It's always worth, when you ask the question, don't just ask what exam boards they take, ask what they take for each subject. Because where it's limited, they might offer limited options for a particular subject. So if I take the one I work at, is yes, we do all boards, but if you want to do history, we only offer 3 choices because we just can't lay on that level of exams. And to be honest, we can't actually store the exam papers in the safe storage. That's one of the biggest limitations we've got, is we've only got so much storage space to lock up the exam centres, lock up the exam papers when we need to, so we limit choices. So you need to ask that question, is what can I do for this subject?
Yeah. And the other thing, when you're talking to exam centres, is it's not their job really to talk you through the rest of the exams process. And commercial centres are probably more likely to be friendly and to help you out a bit more. If you're talking to a local school, they have a very limited amount of time. You're sort of already something else that they don't necessarily want to deal with or have the time to deal with. So it's on you to do all your research first and use the exams wiki, use the Facebook group, use all of those resources. And when you're going to the exam centre, be sort of fairly clear and just ask them, the questions that you need to. Don't expect them to kind of talk you through it and explain how to do it, because that's just not their job. They don't have the time for it. Okay, we're going to move on.
Right, so learning the content. I'm going to speed up a little bit because I waffled at the start.
Yeah.
So how do we learn the content? This is totally on you. And it will depend so much on your child. It will depend on your budget. It will depend on your time. If you're working alongside, it can be easier to outsource. If you've got the time to put the effort, sit there and do the planning yourself, find individual resources, it can be done a lot easier with self-study. So you just need to find what works for your child. And the best way to do this is to take a little bit of time. And it might not feel like it when you're pulling out in year 10, but home education is a lot more efficient than school education. We get through things a lot quicker, and generally you'll be doing less subjects. So you do have time to have a little bit of a cushion to actually work out. There's a page on the wiki, I won't go onto it now, that lists general home ed resources. So tend to be websites that offer lots of different subjects that can be a good place to draw on for subject content while you're establishing what you teach, what subjects you're doing, what specifications you're doing. That's that term, specification. So it's what's a specification? It's a syllabus, basically. How do you find it? The Exam Wiki subject pages have got links to them, but you can find the example websites. I'll look at EdExcel because they're one of the most common ones. So if I wanted to know what I needed to study for GCSE business studies, let's go for that one. I can find the page. Generally, the document is something that you will need to download. This document will tell me what the content is that needs to be covered for this subject and how it's examined. So how many papers, when it's available, if it's an IGCSE.
So international GCSEs have more than one sitting in the year for some of their subjects. So for GCSEs, you can only take them in the summer, apart from a separate maths and English resit if you're over 16. International GCSEs, they have a summer series which has most of their subjects in. They also have a series for Cambridge, it's in November. For EdExcel for next year, it's in January. And then from then on, it's going to be in November and not January anymore. So, and if you're sitting within the next year, you've got the January option. After that, it's going to be a November option for both EdExcel and for Cambridge for the second option for international GCSEs. And that specification is a good place to look if you're not sure if a subject has any coursework or practical requirements that might make it a bit more difficult. That will be in the specification somewhere. It's not always listed in the assessment part, but usually sometimes it's down in an appendix if there's a practical requirement that the centre needs to sign off on.
Yeah,
so
they're all,
check both of those.
like I say, they're all formatted slightly differently.
Yeah.
Just to confuse matters, but you'll get used to reading them. It's one of those things that does. It's also worth knowing and coming back to the specification pages. A lot of people forget about these, but what they have, sample assessments. People forget these papers. They look for past papers, but they forget there's usually sample or specimen papers there. And these can help you decide on subjects and specifications. If you look at the sort of, it can give you an idea of what the paper is going to look like. There's usually also teaching and learning materials. Some of it will be locked that we can't have access, that we don't have access to, but a lot of it is available to us to just freely download. Yeah. And the same under exam materials, past papers.
And some of that stuff can be really useful. Something that not all of the exam boards, but quite a lot have, is what they call a scheme of work, which is the course set out in sort of suggested lessons. And they're designed for a school, but you can take that as sort of a rough idea of how you can divide it up in your own time as well. There's often topic guides. There can be a lot of useful information in here, so it's really worth looking on. Once you've picked a subject, having a look on here, see what's available.
EdXL particularly usually have a subject guide, and these are very, very helpful when it comes to marking. That's when it comes to marking past papers, of telling you what is required. Because sometimes that's tricky, but they're generally good at helping you with that. So I skipped over self-study. Self-study, how to do this, download the specification. That tells you what to study. Most subjects will have an endorsed textbook. Sometimes there's only one. Sometimes you've got a choice. If there's a choice, there's usually no best one. It is a case of going on Amazon, or publishers' websites, looking at sample pages and deciding which one is likely to suit your child best. It can be stupid things like, we like a lot of white space. There's lots of different bits of colour on the page, we don't like it. That helps us decide. Tutors. Recommendations. If you're looking for personal tutors, look for ones online, look for local ones, get recommendations of what will work for you. Try and have a trial session, because they have to be able to work with your child. It's worth finding out what experience they have with this current specification.
And with working with private candidates, because if you've got a tutor that's used to working with school children, they may not be aware of things like the practical issues and how it comes to booking exams. So we do sometimes find that they can, we can do, and they're teaching you aqua chemistry, which actually is difficult to find an exam centre for, and they're just not aware of that.
Courses. There has been an explosion in the last couple of years of courses and tutors offering online provision for home educators. And a lot of these are not tried and tested. So we're seeing people coming through the groups asking, has anybody used this? And the answer is no. That doesn't mean they're not good, but it just means that you have to ask questions of them. We don't know how experienced they are with home educators. That said, there are some that come through the groups and they have glowing you hear lots and lots of positive reviews of them. It is always worth bearing in mind people say the positive. The negative, or even just the meh opinions don't tend to be voiced so much online. People are very positive about what works for them. That doesn't mean they're bad when I'm saying they've got negative reviews. They just might not work for your child. So again, look for sample lessons. Have a think. It's always worth starting off with a list of what do I want from a course. So do I want live lessons? How much marking do I want? What's going to work best for my child?
Yeah, because there's a whole spectrum, and they offer it as this is a GCSE course. Some of them are just a series of videos and online self-marking, and they've got sort of that for every single topic. Some of them are literally once a week with a teacher talking directly to a small group of children, and then maybe setting homework alongside, and there's sort of a lot of variations in between. So just some of them are purely correspondence course. So they're a written assignment and you email it off, and then they give you back written feedback, and you don't ever sort of see a person, or there's no video. So different things suit different people. Some want to be able to do it whenever they like. Some like the timescales of a weekly lesson and set homework. It's all about what works for you and your child.
It's also worth considering that most courses even with online lessons, are only about an hour or an hour and a half a week to cover a content in a year. That is not enough. So you will have to supplement. And it's also worth thinking they are not teachers in the sense of school. If your child isn't doing the homework or isn't reading the feedback, they won't tell you. They will mark what they're given. So most home educators will still need to support the child if they're doing courses. You still need to be saying, have you done this? Let's look over your feedback, etc. You'll still want to be doing past papers when it comes to it. Most courses will not book the exams for you. You will still have to go away and do that. Schedule. Right. So if you're how to study, you set your schedule. So you decide how many subjects a year you're doing, whether you're studying for a year, whether you're studying for 2 years, whether you're studying. My son's taken anywhere from 5 months to 3 years per subject. It depends on our situation at the time. You decide that. If you're looking for advice about how to break it up and how to structure a course, come onto the exams group, ask questions. People will give you advice. We mentioned briefly past papers before. A lot of people ask for past papers at the start of studying. I don't know about you, I would be petrified if I looked at an exam paper and I hadn't studied the content. They can be useful for the parent to look at, to have an idea of what you're aiming for, but generally I wouldn't ask the child to do it until you have studied a good portion of the course. As you get towards the exams though, they are probably the best way of learning, over and over again. We have access to most of them, they are unlocked. It's become trickier the last couple of years because of the exam cancellations. More and more are staying locked for longer. But we can download them from the exam board websites. As I said here, they were under exam materials. Most sites will also, if you Google edit cell past papers, you will find a separate part of the website that's just past papers. And the same with every single exam board has that, apart from Cambridge, which is different. But there's lots and lots of sites that do have Cambridge papers. So if you ask on that, if you ask on the exams group, you'll be pointed towards those.
And past papers also have mark schemes with them.
Yeah.
So for the ones that are available, they will have a mark scheme that tells. Some subjects are easier to mark than others. If you've got something like maths or science, it's usually relatively straightforward to just look at the mark scheme and have a fair idea of what they'll be. If it's something like English, you need a lot more training really to get a good idea of those. There are some services where you can just send off a past paper to be marked. Obviously you pay for that, but that if you're doing it on your own, it can be worth doing that if you're not confident on marking things, or you can just ask other people and start to get advice. And
yeah, there's a lot of subject specific groups where people will give you advice on how to answer the questions.
Yeah, for that particular subject.
So yeah, we've got question papers, mark schemes, examiners reports. So these are feedback on how the candidates answered the questions, and they are incredibly useful reading because it tells you what the examiners are looking for.
Yeah, and often somewhere there's things called exemplars sometimes as well, and those are examples of answers that candidates have given in the exam and what marks they got and why. And again, that can be really helpful.
One problem is with the exemplars, if I give them to students, none of them can read them.
Well, yes.
I've learned I've got to type them out because you've got to read the handwriting.
Okay, so we just quickly do a very brief bit about actually taking the exam. So we talked a bit before when we're looking at centres about when you need to start looking. I said ideally that sort of autumn term before the summer, unless you need access arrangements, in which case even earlier, because there will be an assessment process. That does vary a little bit between the centres. Some of them are more comfortable with access arrangements than others. It tends to be if you go to the centres that support private candidates a lot, they will have a process for access arrangements. They'll know how to deal with it. If you're dealing with a school, they may well just not really know how to deal with that for private candidates. I mean, that's a whole other topic. We won't go into too much detail now, but just be aware you want to start talking to centres and dealing with that earlier on if you need access arrangements. We talked a little about the subjects again. If you sort of say it'll cost me £200-ish for a GCSE subject, then if you get it cheaper, that's good, and you've got spare cash and it's a bonus. But that's kind of the standard cost. And again, people online will say, well, I only paid £50. That's because they had a good school nearby that only charged them cost price. If you find one of those, that is fabulous, but they're not available everywhere. And so you do all the booking beforehand. You'll need ID, which is, and the passport is the easiest. There are other options for photo ID. You can sort of get a photo verified in an ID form from, I think it's the HEQA website, that will usually be accepted, but you will need some form of ID verification, probably when you book it and certainly when you go and sit the exams. And then literally you show up and the exams officer, who is the person who's in charge of organising it, or someone will meet you. They'll take your child. You'll sit either in an exam hall with a bunch of other exam students sitting an exam. If it's a subject there's not very many, it may just be a classroom with a couple of people. It may be an office if it's an exam centre. But they'll do the exam under exam conditions. They'll go home again. And then once all of those are done, it's the results come back at a set date. So for summer exams, it's in August. For January exams, it's March. November exams, I think it's sort of January, February. There'll be a set date. Typically, either the centre will email you or there'll be some sort of portal. So you need to ask them how you're going to find out what the results were on the day. And certificates come through several months after that. So that's the sort of the actual taking the exam bit of it. I think we've got another question about access arrangements. So when, as early as possible. So they would, in a school situation, they would expect to be sort of collecting data from the start of the course, so 2 years before. It doesn't have to be that early for access arrangements, but you need to talk to the centres that you know are available near to you, and you need to say, look, I think, and it's not, you don't know for sure if they will need access arrangements. That's something the centre has to assess and decide upon. But you can say, right, I think they're going to need access arrangements, of these types for these reasons, and then ask them what their process is for that and how they're going to organise it. Will we do another Zoom workshop on this? Hopefully, yes. We're going to try and find some sort of expert on the access arrangements process. I've read all the regulations, but it's not something I've gone through myself.
I just assist with the assessments.
Yeah, so we will try and find a good person to do that. And that is on our list for things to do.
Yes.
And in general, one thing that would be really useful to get from everybody who's here today is what you're most interested in finding out more about. So what should we sort of prioritise in our next?
What do the assessment, just go to the access arrangement, what do assessments involve? It depends on the exam centre. So, and it depends on what access arrangements you are going for. There shouldn't be. It's one of the
the question is there a cost for assessment?
It's in a tricky situation at the moment. There should be no cost for putting them on, but sometimes there is, but that shouldn't be. In terms of assessment, that's currently a grey area of there shouldn't be, but again, we don't really know at the moment. I think Katie's probably better placed to answer that one.
Yeah, there is supposed to be a review of what the law means happening this summer from the Equalities Commission. So that won't change anything, but it should clarify what the actual legal position is. I mean, in general, equalities law is essentially you shouldn't have to pay extra, but it also should be reasonable. So there's the idea of reasonable adjustments, and how much it costs is part of that. So that's why it's sort of a bit of a grey area, because it's sort of, is it reasonable for an exam centre, you know, to do a lot of assessments on every single child when actually maybe there isn't anything to sort of really back up the fact that they need that. So yeah, it's a little bit complicated. So how do you know if they need assessment? It's based upon normal way of working. So I think mostly you know your child. There are some sort of diagnoses which suggest they may. So for instance, if there's autism diagnosis, if there's an EHCP in place, then that's generally a fairly big indicator that there's likely to be some access arrangements needed. The best thing is to have a look on the wiki, see the different types of arrangements there are, and you start to see whether actually some of those might apply. So for instance, extra time is something that applies if there's some identifiable delay in processing. There's laptop uses if their handwriting is either very slow or very hard to read. There's something called rest breaks. So if you think that your child, for whatever reason, is going to be difficult for them to just sit still and focus for 2 hours, there's a rest breaks, which is where they can kind of stop the clock, have a little break away, and then go back to it. So there's lots of different things. Some of them are colour blindness is an access arrangement to deal with if there's colours on the paper that they can't recognise. Large papers, that's another access arrangement if you've got a visual impairment. So there's all sorts of different things that could apply.
When we do, we would put together a set of links to put with the video. Yes, what we'll do is we link to the JCQ access arrangements document, because looking at that is probably a good idea to give you an idea of what can be done. Doesn't mean it'll be on offer to your child, but it's what centres can do. Cost. Yeah, and
sorry, some of those there are sort of standardised tests. So I think for the processing speeds and for reading and writing, aren't there?
Yeah, they've got to have certain times, and
there are some standardised tests. So there's sort of a particular threshold.
Yeah.
So it's not just it's not only, I think they write slowly, can they have extra time? There are assessments and sort of defined requirements about whether that.
And the rules change ever so slightly every year. So centres now have to show that they can't deal with that rest breaks aren't enough before they look at extra time, for example. So they're supposed to try and deal with rest breaks first.
And a little bit further up about the cost is generally per subject, not paper. Generally, but not always. Each centre sets their own pricing. Most of the sort of the big exam centres will be per subject, but occasionally it's per paper. So you just have to ask at the centre what their pricing includes, and how much it will cost for the particular thing you're sitting.
They are linked to the centre. It's again, this is they should be 2005, shouldn't 2020.
Yeah, so this is the question is, how long do access arrangements last? No, there is a timeline, isn't there? Yeah, so they are linked to the centre. So if you move centres, that could be more difficult. In theory, they can reassess at any point and say that is no longer applicable, but they don't have to apply again through the JCQ within up to 4 years. So if they've been arranged for GCSEs, they can roll over to A levels. Again, you often find that's not actually needed, because by A levels you choose the subjects that they can work with. So for the children that needed extra time for, say, a big essay subject, they just don't choose those at A level because they don't really enjoy that. So yes, it should still be accepted, but the centre does kind of have a duty to assess whether it's still needed.
dysgraphia will probably, yes. You don't always need a formal diagnosis for access arrangements.
And centres aren't supposed to just take an external diagnosis. So obviously you may want to need or have a diagnosis for all sorts of reasons, but don't go out and get a diagnosis from a private consultant because you think it will then help with access arrangements. You need to be talking to the centre first. They may send you off to go and get one, but don't just do one on spec because the exam centre is not supposed to accept it just if you show up with a diagnosis of something. They're supposed to run their own assessment.
Normal way of working is quite an essential part of getting access arrangements. Future sessions, how to find out. Let me put up a link to the I put a link to the exams group that we keep mentioning on Facebook. I'll put a link to that in the chat, but we'll put a link.
Yeah, that's the best thing. We'll put it up on there. I may at some point sort out a mailing list just for this, but I haven't done that yet. So the other thing to say is all the sort of little branding of the HEQA, that's the Home Educators Qualifications Association. That's an organisation that I'm a trustee of that has been set up to try and talk to the DFE and to Ofqual and exam boards about some of these issues. So we're talking to them about how home educators use exams, what they can do to help. So there is a website for that and there is a mailing list if you want to join up with that. That's more about sort of the policy side than it is about the day-to-day nuts and bolts. But you know, it's an organisation that's run by home educators. Every home educator is welcome. If you want to join up, please do.
I've got one direct to me. So O-level for Cambridge. So they do exist, but there's not many people that do them now. So I would think they would be accepted, but you might have to explain what they were. You'd have more trouble with them than you would do with IGCSEs, I think. I know a few people have done the O-level for religious studies, but outside that, I'm not sure I do. So that's a question I can't really answer because it's not one that I seem to see people do very often.
And if you're trying anything particularly unusual or outside of the entry requirements that you're looking at, you get in touch with admissions departments. Don't just assume if you've done something different, they won't accept it. Don't assume that they will because you're a home educator and you think it's the same and it's okay. Get in touch with them and ask.
Couple more questions I've seen is, can A-levels be spread out longer than 2 years? Yes, they can, but A-levels are the ones that universities want to see done together usually.
Usually at least 3. So
yeah,
maybe if you do an extra one early, that's, yeah, they won't mind either way about that, but they often want to see that you've taken 3 final A-levels at the same time. There's no rules to stop you. So again, maybe you want to do some A-levels early if you've done GCSEs early, but you probably want to try and get those 3 together.
Well, the question, how do you know if specifications are changing and how early does it come out? So specifications, they don't change that often. And there is usually at least 3 years turnaround in when it will be announced, usually a year before you would expect to be teaching it. And so 3 years before the first exams in that specification.
Yeah, Cambridge changed their specifications slightly more often, obviously every couple of years, but that's usually fairly minor changes. They do change up the books that they use for English literature sort of every couple of years, I think. So you need to sort of look at it for the years that you're expecting to take in. What's the earliest and what's the latest age that a student can take GCSEs? There's no limits on it from an exam board point of view. Some exam centres may have their own rules. They may not want you sitting with the same students if you're under 18, or they may not take very young children. But if you can find an exam centre that's prepared to accept you, and often something like tutors and exams, a private centre will. I mean, we know home educated children have taken them at 11. We know adults who've taken them at 60, 70. There is no time limit. There's no age limit. Can an exam centre refuse to take you? Yes, they can. Particularly for private candidates, no exam centre has to take a private candidate for anything. So that's, I mean, in some ways that's a bit of a difficult position. So for instance, if you're asking a school, they don't have to take private candidates. They don't, there's no requirement. You're just asking for a favour, essentially. I mean, a private centre, there are standard equality rules. So they're not supposed to refuse you just because you require access arrangements or something like that, but they don't have to accept anybody. So it's often quite difficult to sort of make a claim on that basis.
And you've also got the issue with that is spaces.
Yeah.
So there's only so many spaces that they can take. The format of the exams changed due to COVID this year only, in some cases. There are no long-term changes announced so far.
So it has been different. For the last couple of years, what they did was they cancelled the exams and they went to a teacher assessment, which worked in all sorts of different ways. And most of them were not very accessible for private candidates. So it's back to exams this year with a slight change in that we're getting information about what topics will be in the exam, and some of them have reduced content. That should just be for this year. The expectation is that from following year 2023, it's back to normal exams as they were, as the specifications say. There was a question further up: is there any advantage to doing A levels early? Not particularly. Just if you've got a child who's ready for them and wants to, they might enjoy it more than doing GCSEs if that's at a level that they're a bit beyond now. I don't think universities sort of view it as anything particularly good. They just look at the three they've got an offer for in the final year. So yeah, only if they're going to enjoy it. Okay. Anybody else got any other questions? We're about on time.
There's one quick one for you. Is biology easier than human biology? Or the opposite way around, I think it was. Human biology easier than biology?
They're a bit different. One, I mean, I'm doing human biology with my daughter. I haven't done the full biology one. What I would say is that there aren't very many resources for human biology. There's a lot more available for biology, and it's a lot more recognised. So I think if you're on the fence, for me, that alone would push me towards biology. If you've got a child who's really into the human biology part of it, there's a lot of anatomy. So if they're interested in and good at learning, different parts of the heart, circulatory system, bones, muscles, joints, all of that sort of anatomy side, there's more in the human biology, but there just isn't as much available for practice and for learning as there is with biology.
And I think from what I've heard, the human biology, they're a lot more nitpicky on the paper.
I think they might be, and it's more difficult to tell because there aren't extra resources. It's kind of harder than I thought it would be.
Should we do the one last question? Can you sit A levels without sitting GCSEs? Yes.
Yes.
If you're self-studying, there are no requirements for what you need to do to be able to do A levels. If you're going to study A levels at home, no problem. Will you get into sixth form college to sit A levels without GCSEs and IGCSEs? Probably not, to be honest. I've known people that have got in with less than 5 GCSEs, but that has been during COVID, where there's been little bits of allowances and they've been allowed to show their ability. They had been planning to sit the exams and they've just not gone ahead. So yes, if you're self-studying, if you go into college, theoretically, but probably not in practice.
Yeah. And often, I mean, either A levels sort of start from scratch. So something like psychology doesn't there is a psychology GCSE, but most people don't offer it. So you kind of start from scratch, and that's fine. If it's something like a science or a maths, you need to know everything that's in the GCSE anyway before you can access that A-level content. So sort of kind of may as well take the exam and do it, unless there's, you know, it's been really difficult to actually take the exam, but you want to be covering the content really for those subjects. Future sessions, I would say join the HE Exams Wiki Facebook group, and we'll post anything up that we're doing there. The other thing to say is there is a HEQA YouTube channel that the recording of this will be posted on, and we'll post links there. See if I can get a link up for that to put in the chat.
Katie, I've temporarily muted you because you were making some weird ringing noise. I don't know. Try on muting yourself and see if it makes a if you're back.
Sorry about that. So I've just put the YouTube channel into the chat. We'll post the recording here, and we'll also post up a link to all of the links that we've mentioned, the useful links there.
If you've got any more questions, ask them on the exams group. I've spent the day writing frequently asked questions on the wiki. So that is the best source of information we have there for the home educators. So we will answer questions. I know we've not covered everything.
Absolutely, yeah, there's a lot to get through, and both of us are very active on there, and there are a lot of other very experienced, very helpful, very knowledgeable people. So do join that group, put your questions on there, you'll find it helpful. Okay, I think that's us done. Thank you all very much for coming.